You can't understand the Second World War without knowing the mess that came before it. Because as history teaches us, if you don't clean up after dinner, eventually the leftovers will start a war. Because wars don't start out of nowhere. They stew like a bad chili. And this one, it cooked for 20 solid years. Let's wind the clock back to 1918. World War I has just ended, leaving Europe in a state that one might generously describe as traumatized, and less generously as a heap of trench mud, corpses, and broken treaties. Millions were dead. Empires were gone. Russia's Tsar had been eliminated by his own people in abasement. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had disintegrated like a cheap biscuit in a tea, and the Ottoman Empire had gone the way of blockbuster video. It was chaos, with a postmark. And what did the victors do to rebuild the world? They wrote the Treaty of Versailles, a document that combined diplomatic arrogance, economic ignorance, and a pinch of revenge. It blamed Germany for the whole damn thing, handed them a bill so enormous it could have crushed the Alps, and stripped them of territory, dignity, and the right to have any real military. The idea was peace. The result was resentment. And not the quiet, brooding kind, the let's get a dictator and start arming ourselves kind. Meanwhile, in the rest of the world, people were busy losing their minds. The 1920s came strutting in, wearing feathers and jazz. The US was partying so hard it forgot that economies need regulation. Europe, on the other hand, was like a recovering alcoholic at a frat party, sober, angry, and surrounded by bad influences. Then came 1929, and with it, the Wall Street crash. Picture the global economy like a game of Jenga that someone kicked over during a tantrum. Banks collapsed, factories shut down, people lost jobs faster than you could say capitalism. And when people get desperate, they stop voting for the guy in the middle. They go to the fringes. They look for someone who promises order, strength, and maybe a new empire or two. Enter fascism. You've heard of it. Black shirts, military marches, posters of angry men yelling at grain production statistics. Italy was first. Benito Mussolini, journalist, megalomaniac, and pioneer of facial oil, took power in 1922. He turned Italy into a one-party state, invaded Ethiopia, and spent the rest of the decade trying to convince the world he was the new Caesar, even though half his military couldn't figure out which way to hold a rifle. Germany, though, that's where things got especially spicy. After World War I, Germany had formed the Weimar Republic, which was democratic, progressive, and about as stable as a chair with one leg. Hyperinflation hit so hard in the early 1920s that people were using banknotes as wallpaper. That's not a joke. No one trusted the government. Extremist parties flourished. And, in the back of a beer hall in Munich, a failed artist named Adolf Hitler was ranting about betrayal, Jews, Bolsheviks, and pretty much everyone else. He attempted a coup, got thrown in jail, and wrote a little book called Mein Kampf, which, fun fact, was the least readable bestseller in history. By 1933, he convinced a critical mass of Germans that democracy was the problem, not the answer. The Nazis took power. Democracy left the building. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was doing its own terrifying thing under Joseph Stalin, who was busy executing anyone within shouting distance of Moscow and turning farming into a state-run bloodbath. And in Asia, Japan had decided it needed more land, more power, and fewer Chinese people in the way. They invaded Manchuria in 1931, and when the world raised an eyebrow, they said, "What's it gonna do about it?" Spoiler: nothing. Because the League of Nations, the world's new peacekeeping club, was essentially a polite group of diplomats who thought that strong words and awkward silences could stop militarism. They couldn't. They didn't have an army. They just kept passing resolutions and hoping someone else would do the hard part. And so, the 1930s stumbled forward. Germany rearmed openly. Hitler pulled out of the League of Nations, annexed the Rhineland, and nobody stopped him. Italy took Ethiopia. Japan started bombing Shanghai. Spain, not wanting to be left out, went into civil war. And Britain and France? They watched. They worried. And they kept trying to appease the fascists, which is diplomatic code for crossing fingers and praying it'll all calm down on its own. The United States, by the way, was busy being deeply isolationist. They'd had enough of foreign entanglements, thank you very much. And besides, they were still climbing out of the Depression. FDR was fixing the economy with alphabet soup programs and didn't want to get dragged into another European mess. Technologically, the world was primed for mayhem. Airplanes had evolved from wooden kites to sleek bombers. Tanks were no longer experimental oddities. They were mobile death boxes. Radios could broadcast propaganda to millions. Machine guns, grenades, flamethrowers, all the greatest hits were back, and better than ever. And the worst part? Everyone knew it. This wasn't a surprise party. This was a slow, terrible build-up with every red flag waving in plain sight. Hitler annexed Austria in 1938, then took a slice of Czechoslovakia, and then the whole country. Britain and France, still hoping to avoid war, handed him concessions like he was an angry toddler in a supermarket. By 1939, the world was standing on a cliff, whistling nervously, pretending not to notice the growling volcano beneath their feet. And then, in September, it happened. Hitler invaded Poland. Britain and France finally, out of patience and delusions, declared war. The lights went out across Europe. 1939. The year Poland gets uninvited guests from both sides. The year Europe officially lost its last nerve, and the world hit start on the deadliest game of geopolitical Jenga ever played. It began with a map, a moustache, and a lie, or rather, several lies, stitched together by one increasingly unhinged dictator, and a world so afraid of another war that it was willing to believe the best of a man who screamed his intentions into microphones on a weekly basis. Germany, under Adolf Hitler, had spent the previous few years perfecting the art of aggressive real estate acquisition. First came Austria in 1938, Anschluss, as they called it. Basically the Nazi version of a family reunion with tanks. No bullets fired, just cheers and flags, and an entire country suddenly part of the Reich. Next came the Sudetenland, a delicious slice of Czechoslovakia, rich with German-speaking folks. Hitler claimed it was about ethnic unity. Europe, still hungover from World War I, said, sure, why not? And handed it over in the infamous Munich Agreement. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain even returned home waving a piece of paper and declaring peace for our time. Spoiler, it was not peace. It was barely an intermission. By March 1939, Hitler gobbled the rest of Czechoslovakia, not German-speaking, mind you, and Europe started to realize that appeasement was less a policy and more a nervous breakdown. And still, the question hung in the air like mustard gas. Would anyone actually stop him? Enter Poland. Poor, proud, sandwich Poland. Situated between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, it was the geographical equivalent of being trapped between two bears, arguing over who gets the first bite. Hitler had set his eyes eastward, craving Lebensraum, meaning living space, which in practice meant kicking out, relocating, or murdering millions of people and planting flags on their land. Poland was next on the menu. But there was a snag. Britain and France. This time they swore it would be different. After watching Hitler devour Austria and Czechoslovakia with zero pushback, they finally drew a line in the sand. In March 1939, they guaranteed Poland's independence. It was like watching someone promise to protect a stray cat from a pack of wolves using only polite language and a firm tone. Meanwhile, Hitler was preparing. German troops marched along the border. But there was one crucial complication: the Soviet Union. Stalin wasn't exactly on speaking terms with Hitler, given their ideological differences and the whole Nazi Germany wants to destroy Bolshevism thing. But Hitler didn't want a two-front war. So he made Stalin an offer. Thus came one of the most cynical world deals in modern history, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed on August 23rd, 1939. This non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union stunned the world. But the real kicker was the secret protocol. The two agreed to carve up Eastern Europe like a pie. Poland would be split down the middle. The Baltics and Finland, Soviet snack. Hitler and Stalin shook hands, gritted teeth, and pretended to like each other. With that deal inked, Hitler had what he wanted: a free hand in the East. No more waiting, no more diplomacy. September 1st, 1939, at 4:45 a.m., the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on a Polish garrison at Westerplatte. Simultaneously, German troops surged across the border, tanks rolling, Stuka dive bombers screaming overhead. Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, was unleashed for the first time. A terrifying, fast-paced military strategy that relied on speed, coordination, and overwhelming force. Poland never stood a chance. Let's be clear, the Polish military was brave, proud, and not merely as backward as the propaganda would later suggest. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered. German forces moved fast, hitting supply lines, communication hubs, and cities with a cold, calculated ferocity. Britain and France, bound by their guarantee, declared war on Germany on September 3rd. But, and here's the depressing bit, they didn't actually do much. This period became known as the Phony War, or Blitzkrieg, where everyone was technically at war, but no one wanted to make the first aggressive move. Troops sat on the French border drinking tea while Poland burned. And then, as if things couldn't get any worse for Poland, September 17th, 1939, the Soviet Union, keeping its end of the Molotov-Ribbentrop bargain, invaded Poland from the east. Stalin claimed he was protecting ethnic Ukrainians and Belarusians because apparently irony was alive and well in Moscow. Polish forces, already reeling from the German assault, now had to deal with a second invading army. It was a blitz sandwich, and Poland was the meat. By early October, Poland had fallen. Warsaw lay in ruins. Thousands of Polish soldiers fled to Romania, Hungary, and beyond, forming the basis of a government in exile. the country was carved in two, half Nazi, half Soviet, and both occupiers wasted no time in unleashing terror. On the German side, mass executions, forced relocations, and the beginning of what would become the Holocaust. The Nazi machine started cataloguing people, banning Polish culture, and targeting Jews, intellectuals, priests, and anyone who might pose a problem. On the Soviet side, mass deportations, political purges, and the notorious Katyn massacre, where thousands of Polish officers were executed and buried in secret. The Soviets denied responsibility for decades. Spoiler, it was them. And the rest of the world? Watching, waiting, rearming slowly. The fall of Poland was a brutal wake-up call. Blitzkrieg had worked. Appeasement had failed. The war was real. But for the next several months, Europe held its breath. There were no immediate invasions westward, just silence, an anxious, ominous pause before the storm truly broke. In hindsight, 1939 was the year the world's illusion shattered. The idea that Hitler could be reasoned with? Dead. The belief that Soviets were too ideologically opposed to cooperate with fascists? Laughable. The assumption that another major war could be avoided? Obliterated. World War II had begun. And the scariest part? No one knew how bad it was going to get. (1940) Poland is gone, carved up like a holiday roast by Germany and the Soviet Union. Britain and France are technically at war with Germany, but there's a whole lot of standing around and not much shooting going on. This strange interlude is what history calls the Phony War, or as Germans mockingly refer to it, Sitzkrieg, a war of sitting. In Britain, school children were being evacuated to the countryside. Gas masks were handed out like party favours, and sandbags were stacked in front of pubs. But military? Not much action. France, with its famously confident generals and supposedly impregnable Maginot Line, a massive string of fortifications along the German border, was convinced Germany wouldn't dare attack head-on. In a way, they were right. Hitler didn't attack head-on. He went around. But before we get there, let's take a detour north, because Hitler, ever the multitasker, decided 1940 was the year to secure the northern flank. Resources, baby. Norway and Sweden had iron ore, vital for German industry, and Hitler wasn't about to let the British get cozy up there. So, in April 1940, he invaded Denmark and Norway. Denmark folded faster than a lawn chair. Norway, bless it, fought back, led by King Haakon VII, who was in exile and sort of aided by the British. The campaign was chaotic, snowy, and a wake-up call to Britain, which realised it had a lot of brass buttons, but not much actual coordination. Back home in London, the Norwegian fiasco triggered political upheaval. Neville Chamberlain, Mr. Peace for Our Time, found himself out of a job. In May 1940, a gruff, cigar-chomping bulldog named Winston Churchill took the reins as Prime Minister. He was not a consensus choice. In fact, many thought he was a warmongering relic, but history would prove, when the world is burning, sometimes you need a fire to fight fire. Now, France. In May, Hitler launched For Gelb, or the Mainston Plan, or Case Yellow, his masterstroke to crush the West. French and British commanders were expecting a repeat of the World War I, Slow, trenchy, predictable. But the Germans had been cooking up something very different. Blitzkrieg returned. This time, aimed west. The plan? Fight an attack through Belgium, as expected, draw Allied forces forward, and then punch through the Ardennes forest, a region so rugged the French believed no army could move through it. That assumption was, in hindsight, a catastrophic error. German panzer divisions barreled through Ardennes like it was a country road. They bypassed the Maginot Line entirely, cut behind the Allied forces, and suddenly the front line was behind them. Panic erupted. French defences collapsed like a souffle in a thunderstorm. The British Expeditionary Force, along with tens of thousands of French troops, found themselves trapped near the coast at Dunkirk. Here comes the miracle. Operation Dynamo. Between May 26 and June 4th, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were evacuated across the English Channel. And it wasn't just warships. Civilian boats, fishing vessels, ferries, pleasure cruisers joined the effort. It was desperate. It was messy. But it worked. Over 330,000 troops escaped. It was, Churchill said, a miracle of deliverance. But let's not sugarcoat it. France was finished. On June 10th, Mussolini, sensing opportunity like a hyena eyeing a dying zebra, declared war on the Allies. Italy's involvement was largely symbolic at this stage, but the optics were dramatic. 4 days later, on June 14th, German troops marched into Paris. The City of Lights went dark. The French government fled south. By June 22nd, an armistice was signed. France was split in two. The north and west were under direct German occupation. The south became Vichy France, a puppet regime under Marshal Pétain that collaborated with the Nazis and generally tried to pretend they weren't being held at knife point. It was a national humiliation. France, once Europe's military powerhouse, had lasted just 6 weeks. And in Berlin, Hitler was giddy. The man strutted through captured Paris like a kid in a candy store. He made a surprise visit to the city, admired the Eiffel Tower, allegedly ordering the lift cables cut so he wouldn't have to share the view, and left feeling like a god. His gamble had worked again. But across the Channel, Britain stood alone, and this is where Churchill came into his own. He delivered his now legendary speeches. "We shall fight on the beaches or we shall never surrender," and his words were steel. The country braced for invasion, and Hitler, for all his swagger, wasn't sure how to proceed. Operation Sea Lion, the code name for a German invasion of Britain, was drafted but never executed. Why? Because Hitler needed air superiority, and so began the Battle of Britain. Starting in July and stretching into autumn, the German Luftwaffe began bombing British airfields, radar stations, and eventually civilian cities. This was the Blitz. Bombs over London, night after night. Entire neighbourhoods reduced to rubble. Children evacuated again. Londoners sleeping in underground stations. Fire, ash, sirens. And yet, Britain didn't break. RAF pilots, many of them in their teens and early 20s, fought tooth and nail. Outnumbered, exhausted, and flying by the skin of their teeth, they held the skies. Radar gave them an edge. So did home turf and sheer bloody-minded determination. By October, Hitler called it off. The invasion was postponed indefinitely. Britain alone had stood firm. Hitler turned his eyes elsewhere, eastward. But we will get to that. Back to the 1940s highlights. The US, still officially neutral, passed the Selective Training and Service Act, its first peacetime draft. The writing was on the wall. Franklin D. Roosevelt won an unprecedented third term, making it clear that America wasn't quite done meddling in European affairs. It was a powerful signal that the United States was prepared to stand as a pillar of democracy and global leadership at a time when the free world desperately needed both. And in the East, Japan continued its war in China, eyeing Southeast Asia and planning quietly for a confrontation with the US. 1940 was a year of collapse and defiance of falling giants and unexpected stands. The war had gone from terrifying to apocalyptic. And worse still, it was only just beginning. 1941. Let's begin in Europe. Hitler, feeling mighty smug after bulldozing half the continent in 1940, was riding high. France fallen, Britain bombed but stubborn, the Soviet Union mysteriously quiet thanks to the non-aggression pact signed in 1939. Now, if you know anything about Adolf Hitler, you know the man didn't do quiet. Hitler had never intended the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact to be more than a delay. He loathed Bolshevism with the intensity of 1,000 burning flags. Stalin, in Hitler's eyes, was both a racial and ideological enemy, and Germany's destiny, Hitler believed, was to push eastward, to conquer, to cleanse, to colonize. Lebensraum, remember? That horrible euphemism for stealing land and committing mass murder? So while everyone was watching the skies over London in 1940, Hitler was secretly planning Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. Really, this wasn't just a military campaign. It was a war of annihilation. On June 22nd, 1941, without warning or formal declaration, Germany turned on its temporary ally and launched a three-pronged assault into Soviet Union. 3 massive army groups. Army Group North, heading for Leningrad. Army Group Center, gunning for Moscow. Army Group South, plunging into Ukraine. 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border, supported by hundreds of thousands of Axis troops from Italy, Romania, Hungary, and others. Tanks, artillery, planes, infantry. It was Blitzkrieg on steroids. And Stalin? Shocked, utterly blindsided. Despite numerous warnings from spies, diplomats, and even Winston bloody Churchill, Stalin refused to believe Hitler would betray the pact. When the attack came, he reportedly shut himself away in his dacha for days, stunned into inaction. The early weeks were a bloodbath. Soviet forces were poorly prepared, poorly led, thanks to Stalin's purges, and completely overwhelmed. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed. Cities burned. Civilians fled in terror. But here's the thing about Russia. It's big. Like really big. And cold. And very, very good at absorbing invasions until the invaders freeze, starve, or get eaten by wolves and counter-offensives. While the Germans made staggering gains in summer and fall, they couldn't knock the Soviets out. Leningrad held under siege. Moscow resisted. The Red Army reeling began to recover, and by December, the Germans had overextended themselves. Over in Asia, Japan was neck-deep in its war with China, which had started back in 1937. The Japanese Empire had imperial ambitions the size of their ego, and they wanted more resources. Oil, rubber, tin, the kind you find in Southeast Asia. The problem? The United States had been watching Japan with increasing irritation. When Japan occupied French Indochina in 1940-41, America finally snapped. President Roosevelt froze Japanese assets and, more importantly, cut off oil exports. That's right. The US cut off Japan's gas money. Japan's response? Not diplomacy. On December 7th, 1941, a quiet Sunday morning, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The goal was simple: knock out the US Pacific Fleet in one massive strike by time to conquer Southeast Asia and secure access to resources while Americans scrambled to recover. It was a stunningly executed assault. Hundreds of planes took off from Japanese carriers and rained bombs and torpedoes down on the American base in Hawaii. In under 2 hours, 2,400 Americans were dead. 8 battleships were damaged or sunk. Over 300 aircraft destroyed or crippled. It was a brutal gut punch. But it wasn't the knockout blow Japan hoped for. Why? Because the US aircraft carriers, the real game changers, were out of sea. And because, as Admiral Yamamoto famously said, Japan had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. The very next day, December 8th, Congress declared war on Japan. And then, plot twist, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. No one forced Hitler's hand there, he just did it. Some think he wanted to show solidarity with Japan, others think he thought the US was a paper tiger. Whatever the reason, it meant this: the United States was now fully in the war. Suddenly, the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, were up against not just the UK and the USSR, but the full industrial might of the United States. It's hard to overstate what a shift this was. The US had a massive population, vast resources, and the ability to outproduce every Axis nation combined. And now, they were pissed. Meanwhile, back on the Eastern Front, things were starting to go sideways for Hitler. His armies had reached the outskirts of Moscow, but the Soviet capital didn't fall. Instead, winter hit. And not just any winter, the kind of Russian winter that makes vodka freeze. German troops, outfitted for a short campaign, found themselves in snow up to their waist, fighting an enemy that was adapting faster than expected. Soviet reinforcements, many from Siberia, launched a counterattack in December. Moscow held. The Germans fell back. 1941 ended with chaos on every front. Europe was under Axis occupation, but Britain stood firm. The Soviet Union had been battered, but was unbroken. The United States had entered the war, bringing with it the capacity to turn the tide. North Africa, the Balkans, China, the Pacific, all were now active battlegrounds. This was no longer Hitler's European war. It was World War II in every terrifying sense. 1941 was the year it became truly global. It was the year the war woke up. 1942. Let's start with Europe, especially the Soviet Union. After Hitler's backstabbing blitz in 1941, the Eastern Front turned into an absolute meat grinder. German forces had failed to take Moscow and were now digging in for another push, convinced that one more big offensive would break the Soviets once and for all. So Hitler, in his infinite delusional wisdom, decided 1942 would be the year he took the oil-rich Caucasus region and the symbolic city of Stalingrad. Why Stalingrad? Why not just focus on oil fields and leave the symbolic cities alone? Well, because it had Stalin's name on it. And for Hitler, that was like waving a red flag at a very angry, very genocidal bull. So off they went. Operation Blue, a sprawling plan to seize Soviet oil, crush the Red Army in the south, and maybe, just maybe, win the war in the east. It started off strong. The Germans advanced quickly. Soviet forces fell back. Cities were captured. Hitler was feeling pretty smug. Then they reached Stalingrad. The battle for this city, which started in late summer and raged through the end of the year, was less a conventional fight and more a descent to hell. Bombed into rubble by the Luftwaffe, Stalingrad turned into a sniper's paradise and a soldier's nightmare. House-to-house combat, room to room, sewer to sewer. It wasn't about tactics anymore, it was about endurance. The Germans called it the Rattenkrieg, Rat War, and the Soviets under General Zhukov were preparing something big. They let the Germans pour in. Then, in November, they encircled them. Operation Uranus. Yes, that's the actual name. They smashed through the weak Romanian and Italian lines, guarding the flanks, and trapped the German 6th Army inside the city. Cut off, starving, freezing. Hitler, naturally, forbade them from retreating. They would hold to the last man. And they did. But spoiler, it didn't end well. By the end of 1942, the once invisible Wehrmacht was stuck in the ruins of a city it didn't need, with Red Army tightening the noose. Now, let's hop across a map to North Africa. Because if there's one thing the Allies loved in 1942, it was fighting in deserts. The British had been locked in a back and forth with the Axis powers in Egypt and Libya, trading blows like two sunburned drunks in a sandstorm. The German African Corps, led by the dashing and frustratingly competent Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, aka the Desert Fox, had pushed dangerously close to the Suez Canal. Enter El Alamein. In October 1942, British General Bernard Montgomery launched a massive counter-offensive. The Second Battle of El Alamein was brutal, but it turned the tide. Rommel's forces were pushed west, and the British finally had a win to brag about. Churchill, never the one to miss a dramatic quote, declared, "This is not the end. This is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning." Poetic, sure. Confusing? Absolutely. But he wasn't wrong. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States was finally making waves. Literally. After Pearl Harbor, the US military had to get up to speed fast. 1942 saw the first major American ground operation in the war, Operation Torch, an Allied invasion of French North Africa. African and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria in November, facing mostly Vichy France troops, who weren't exactly thrilled to be fighting their supposed liberators. But eventually, the Allies secured the territory and began pushing toward Tunisia, where Rommel was preparing his last stand in Africa. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't quick, but it was the beginning of an Allied push that would end up in Sicily less than a year later. Now, let's say over to the Pacific, where 1942 was frankly an absolute bloodbath. In rapid succession, they seized the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Hong Kong, and the Dutch East Indies. It was an imperial buffet. Western colonies fell like dominoes, and the Allies were reeling. The worst moment? Possibly the fall of the Philippines in April. The US and Filipino troops made a heroic stand at the Bedtime Peninsula, but were eventually overwhelmed. Survivors were forced to endure the Bataan Death March, a brutal forced relocation that killed thousands. But then came the cracks. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May was the first naval battle in history where the ships never saw each other. It was all fought by aircraft. Technically a draw, but strategically a win. It stopped Japanese expansion toward Australia. Then came Midway in June. The US Navy, armed with correct Japanese codes and a healthy dose of guts, ambushed the Japanese fleet. In one day, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk. It was a staggering loss, one from which Japan's navy never fully recovered. And finally, in August, the Americans landed in Guadalcanal. It was supposed to be a quick operation. It turned into a 6-month slog of jungle warfare, disease, and a nightmarish naval battles. By the end of the year, the US held the island. Japan was no longer advancing. They were digging in. 1942 was a brutal, bloody year. But, for the first time since the war began, there was hope. Real hope. The Axis had overreached. The Allies had learned how to punch back. And as we close this chapter, just remember, the tide has turned, but the waves are far from calm. 1943. Let's start in the East, because if there's one place that deserves top billing in 1943, it's Stalingrad. Remember that frozen meat grinder from the last chapter? Well, it ended in early February 1943, and the result was catastrophic for Germany. The Sixth Army, once Hitler's pride and joy, was annihilated. Nearly 300,000 men went into Stalingrad. Fewer than 100,000 came out. Most surrendered, frostbitten and starving. Hitler refused to believe it at first. When he did, he sulked like a toddler who just dropped his ice cream. The loss wasn't just military, it was psychological. The aura of invincibility surrounding the Wehrmacht cracked wide open. And the Red Army? Emboldened, enraged, and just getting started. By summer, the Soviets were ready to flex. Cue the Battle of Kursk, July 1943. The largest tank battle in history. Think thousands of tanks, miles of trenches, endless smoke and fire. The Germans launched Operation Citadel, hoping to punch through a Soviet bulge in the front line. Instead, they hit minefields dug in defences and a Red Army that knew it was coming. the Soviets held, counterattacked, and sent the Germans into retreat. For good. From this point on, the Germans would never launch another strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. They were on the run. Now, over to the Mediterranean, where the Allies had wrapped up their North African vacation and were looking for the next sunny destination to liberate. They chose Italy. First stop, Sicily. In July, British and American forces invaded the island. It was hot, chaotic, and full of landmines, fascists, and goats. But the Allies moved fast, and within weeks, the Axis defences crumbled. The fall of Sicily spooked Italy's king Victor Emmanuel III. He sacked Mussolini, who was promptly arrested, shaved emotionally, if not literally, and replaced by a new government that secretly started peace talks with the Allies. But Hitler wasn't about to let Italy drift off the fascist ship. He sent in troops, rescued Mussolini in a dramatic mountaintop raid, and installed him as a head of Nazi puppet state in the north. Italy was now a battlefield, divided between Germans and Allies, with Italians caught in the middle. In September, the Allies landed on the Italian mainland in Salerno. It was a tough slog. The terrain was mountainous, and German defence stubborn, and the weather miserable. Italy became a slow, bloody campaign, far less glamorous than Sicily. But it meant this. Hitler was now fighting on yet another front. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States was becoming a war machine. By 1943, American factories were cranking out planes, tanks, bullets, and boots at a rate that made Axis commanders break out in stress rashes. The US had entered the war late, but it arrived with an industrial haymaker. And not just gear, manpower. American troops were shipping out by the thousands. First-time fighters, sure, but increasingly well-trained and ready to make some noise. In the air, the Allies began a new strategy. Round-the-clock bombing. The British RAF bombed by night. The US Army Air Forces bombed by day. The target? German industry, cities, and morale. The campaign was controversial then and now. Cities like Hamburg were flattened. Thousands of civilians died. Morally grey, absolutely, but strategically, it started to chip away at Germans' ability to make war. And let's not forget the Atlantic, where German U-boat had turned the sea into graveyard. Allied convoys were being picked off in horrifying numbers. But in 1943, new technology, long-range aircraft, improved sonar, and better tactics finally started turning the tide. The Battle of the Atlantic reached a turning point. U-boat losses soared. By the end of the year, the sea lanes were safer and Allied supplies could flow freely again. Over in the Atlantic, things were heating up too. After the bloodbath of Guadalcanal, the US launched its island-hopping campaign. Instead of liberating every island, the plan was to leapfrog from one strategic position to another, cutting off Japanese strongholds and pushing ever closer to Tokyo. In November, the US hit the Gilbert Islands, Tarawa in particular. The battle lasted 3 days and cost over 3,000 American and 4,500 Japanese lives. It was one of the first times Americans saw uncensored images of dead Marines on beaches. The shock was real, but so was the resolve. Meanwhile, in occupied territories across Europe and Asia, resistant movements were growing bolder. Sabotage, assassinations, intelligence gathering. Local fighters were risking everything to bleed the Axis from within. their contribution, often unsung but vital. Also, in 1943, the Tehran Conference brought together the Big Three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, in the same room for the first time. They agreed on one major thing: a second front in Europe, the long-awaited invasion of Nazi-held France. But that's for the next chapter. 1943 was the beginning of the end. The Axis still held territory, yes, but the tide had turned. Germany was retreating in Russia. Italy was collapsing. Japan was being pushed back. Island by bloody island. And the Allies? They were coordinating, planning, and gearing up for the final act. But make no mistake, the fighting was far from over, and the worst horrors of the war, especially those hidden behind barbed wire and SS smiles, had yet to be revealed. 1944. Let's start with Normandy. June 6th, 1944. D-Day. Operation Overlord. The day the Allies finally kicked down Hitler's front door in Western Europe. The Allies had spent years preparing for this. Maps, models, rehearsals, decoys. They even hired actors. Yeah, really. British stage magician Jesper Maskelyne helped design fake tanks and dummy landing craft to fool German recon. The ruse? Convince Hitler the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Meanwhile, 156,000 troops, 5,000 ships, and over 11,000 aircraft prepared to cross the English Channel. The night before, airborne troops dropped behind enemy lines. Paratroopers from the US 82nd and 101st and the British 6th Airborne landed in pitch darkness, often in the wrong places, often into a storm of bullets. Then the beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword, each with its own bloodbath. Omaha was the worst. American troops waded into a storm of German machine gun fire, artillery, and obstacles. The first waves were torn apart, but they kept coming. By nightfall, despite the chaos, the beaches were held. D-Day wasn't a clean victory. It was gritty, brutal, and almost went off the rails. But it succeeded, and it marked the beginning of the end of Nazi Germany in the West. By late June, the Allies were pouring men and material into France. The Battle of Normandy was on. Hitler, in all his tactical brilliance, refused to allow German commanders to retreat or maneuver. Instead, he tried to hold the line with sheer stubbornness. Bad call. In late July, the Americans broke out in St. Lo, launching Operation Cobra. Armed divisions punched through the German lines. The British and Canadians pressed from the east. German forces were pushing into a pocket around Falaise, and the trap closed. By August, Paris rose. The French resistance, emboldened and fed up, launched an uprising. The Allies marched in soon after, led by Free French forces under General de Gaulle. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated. Crowds cheered, flags flew, and for the first time in 4 years, the City of Light was free. Now, let's rewind a few months, because while the West was preparing for D-Day, the Soviets were not sitting idle. They launched Operation Bagration in June, a massive offensive against Army Group Center in Belarus. And when I say massive, I mean biblical. Over 2.3 million Soviet troops smashed through German lines, obliterating entire divisions. It made D-Day look like a warm-up, By August, the Soviets had reached Warsaw, which unfortunately brings us to the heartbreak of the Warsaw Uprising. The Polish resistance rose up expecting Soviet support, but Stalin, ever the opportunist, let them bleed. He halted his advance, allowing Germans to crush the uprising, destroying much of the city and killing thousands. It was a calculated move. Stalin didn't want a free Poland. He wanted a Soviet Poland. And by letting the resistance die, he cleared the way. Now, let's hop over to Italy, still grinding on like a rusty meat grinder. The Allies pushed north, capturing Rome on June 4th, just 2 days before D-Day. But Hitler had fortified the Gothic Line, his last stronghold in the north, and progress slowed. The terrain was hell. The Germans were dug in. Casualties mounted. Meanwhile, Mussolini, having been rescued and installed in the puppet Italian Social Republic, was now Hitler's sidekick in name only. His power was a joke. His days were numbered. In the air, the Allied bombing campaign intensified. Cities like Dresden would get their turn later, but in 1944, German industry was already under constant assault. Oil refineries, factories, railways, nothing was safe. But the real terror in the skies? The V1 and V2 rockets. Hitler's so-called vengeance weapons began hitting London in mid-1944. The V1s were jet-powered flying bombs, loud, fast, and terrifying. The V2s were silent ballistic missiles. No warning, just a boom. They caused panic, but strategically, too little too late. Hitler needed miracles. Instead, he got retreat. In the Pacific, the US continued its island hopping. In June, American forces invaded Saipan, which brought Japan within range of B-29 bombers. Then, in October, the US returned to the Philippines. General MacArthur, never one to understate his importance, weighed ashore and declared, "I have returned." The Japanese, unwilling to lose the island without a fight, threw their entire fleet into the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. They lost. Badly. Japan was losing ships, islands, and hope. Now, the highlight of this year. Hitler's birthday. On July 20th, 1944, a group of German officers, led by Klaus von Stauffenberg, attempted to assassinate the Führer with a briefcase bomb at his headquarters in East Prussia. Operation Valkyrie. The bomb went off. 4 people died, but not Hitler. He survived with minor injuries, mostly because the briefcase got nudged behind a heavy table leg. Lucky, unfortunately. In response, Hitler unleashed a purge. Thousands were arrested, hundreds executed, the conspirators punished. Even mild dissenters were swept up. The resistance within Germany, always fragile, was crushed. So, 1944 in a nutshell. D-Day happened, Paris was liberated, Rome fell. Germany got squeezed from both sides, Japan lost Philippines and most of its navy. Hitler survived an assassination attempt, but barely. The war was not over, not yet, but the Axis powers were losing ground, losing allies, and losing any illusion of victory. One more year, dear listener. One more year. 1945 is coming. (1945). Let's begin in Europe, where Germany was cracking like a cheap floorboard under a marching band. On the Western Front, the Allies had pushed out of Normandy and liberated France. They were now clawing their way across Belgium, the Netherlands, into the Western Germany. Cities fell one after another. The Siegfried Line, Germany's final defensive barrier, was breached. But then, in the last desperate gasp, Hitler made one more gamble. The Battle of the Bulge. December 1944. Snow, fog, and confusion. German forces launched a surprise counter-offensive, punching through weak American lines in Belgium. It was Hitler's fantasy of turning the tide, splitting the Allied armies and suing for peace. It didn't work. The Americans held key towns like Bastogne, defended by the 101st Airborne, and reinforced by General Patton's Third Army in now legendary forced march. After weeks of vicious winter fighting, the Germans were pushed back. They'd spent the last of their reserves on ghost of a plan. From here on out, it was retreat, rubble, and reckoning. Meanwhile, in the east, the Soviets were coming in hot. Stalin's armies surged westward with vengeance in their boots. Warsaw was finally liberated in January. Budapest after a brutal siege. By April, the Red Army had stormed into Berlin itself. This wasn't a neat surgical operation. It was street by street, basement by basement. The German capital was battered by artillery, crawling with desperate defenders and civilians trying to survive the end of the world. And, in the middle of it all, one angry little man in a bunker. Adolf Hitler, now delusional and twitching from a cocktail of paranoia, defeat, and digestive problems, refused to leave. He ordered non-existent armies to defend the city, blamed everyone else for his failure, and married Eva Braun in the final hours of his life. On April 30th, 1945, they both took their lives. Hitler by gun, Eva by poison. Their bodies were burned in a shallow crater behind the bunker. And just like that, the Führer was gone. The war in Europe was almost over. Germany officially surrendered on May 7th, ratified on May 8th, 1945. VE Day, victory in Europe. Streets exploded with joy. Flags, kisses, champagne, tears. But not everyone was celebrating, because while the war was ending in Europe, it was still raging in the Pacific. In 1945, Japan was bleeding from 1,000 wounds. The Allies had pushed through the Philippines and taken Iwo Jima in February at staggering cost. The famous flag rising? Heroic, yes, but it came in a battle that left nearly 7,000 Americans and over 20,000 Japanese dead. Then came Okinawa, April to June. The last stepping stone to the Japanese home islands. It was hell. Kamikaze pilots slammed into Allied ships. Japanese troops fought to the death. No surrender, no quarter. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Over 200,000 died in the battle. And the message was clear. If invading Japan looked anything like this, it would be carnage. And then came the bombs. The United States had been working in absolute secrecy on a weapon so powerful it would reshape the world. The Manhattan Project, a sprawling multi-billion-dollar research effort that produced the first atomic bombs. On July 16th, the first test, Trinity, was detonated in the New Mexico desert. The ground turned into glass. The sky caught fire. Scientists and generals alike stared in awe and horror. The genie was out. President Harry Truman, now in office after Roosevelt's death in April, faced a choice. An invasion of Japan could cost up to 1 million Allied lives by some estimates. Japan showed no signs of surrender. So, the decision was made. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb, lit a boy, on the city of Hiroshima. The city was obliterated in a flash. Tens of thousands killed instantly. Thousands more from radiation. Entire neighborhoods vaporized. Japan still didn't surrender. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. More death and more silence followed. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender over the radio. The war was over. On September 2nd, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan formally surrendered. Papers were signed, flags were lowered, and the most devastating war in human history was finally finished. But let's not wrap it all up too neatly, because 1945 also peeled back the curtain on humanity's darkest sins. As Allied forces moved through Germany, they liberated concentration camps, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dachau, and so many others. The world saw the skeletons, the gas chambers, the mass graves, the Holocaust. Systematic, industrialized genocide. 6 million Jews, millions more Romani, disabled people, political prisoners, LGBTQ individuals, murdered, not in a battle, but in cold bureaucratic horror. The full scale was unimaginable, but it had to be seen. In November 1945, the Nuremberg trials began. For the first time in history, world leaders were held legally accountable for crimes against humanity. It was imperfect, incomplete, but it mattered. The war ended, but the scars didn't. Europe was in ruins. Asia was shattered. Refugees filled roads. Cities were ash and dust, and 2 mushroom clouds hovered forever in the rearview mirror. But out of the wreckage came new beginnings. The United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the rebuilding of Europe and Japan. The Cold War would follow, yes, but for a moment the world stood together and said, never again. So there you have it. The year the war ended. The year the world changed. The battles are done. The flags have fallen. And morning has come. The guns have gone silent. The uniforms were hung. The rubble still smouldering. And across the world, stunned survivors blinked into a new light of peace. 1945 is behind us. The war is over, but victory, as it turns out, is not a neat little bow you tie around a blood-soaked package. The first major act was the surrender of Germany, signed in Reims on May 7th, 1945, and again in Berlin on May 8th, to please the Soviets. Japan followed on September 2nd aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The signatures were dramatic, the speeches stiff, the ink barely dry before the world had to ask, now what? The answer, of course, depended entirely on who you asked. Let's start with Europe, a continent in shambles. Cities like Warsaw, Berlin, Dresden, and Rotterdam had been pulverized. Entire economies had collapsed. Tens of millions were dead, millions more were displaced. Refugees, former prisoners, concentration camp survivors, orphaned children, and soldiers with nowhere to go. The immediate job? Pick up the pieces, feed the people, rebuild. Germany was carved into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Berlin too, though it lay entirely in the Soviet zone. The country had to be denazified, demilitarized, and eventually somehow democratized. But that process would prove contentious. The Allies tried to work together, they really did, but it was like watching divorced parents trying to co-parent a teenager who just burned the house down. The Soviets, having lost over 20 million people and carried the brunt of the war in Europe, were in no mood for subtlety. Stalin wanted security. That meant a buffer zone for pro-Soviet states in Eastern Europe. Elections? Sure, if they elected communists. Western allies, meanwhile, were suddenly aware that their wartime buddy, Uncle Joe, had a thing for crushing dissent and never letting go of a country once he parked a tank in it. Cue the Iron Curtain. But before the Cold War could freeze the globe, there were still trials to hold and a new world to sketch. Enter the Nuremberg trials, starting in November 1945. Top Nazi officials were tried for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. For the first time in history, leaders were held to account on the international stage. Hermann Göring, found guilty, swallowed poison before hanging. Rudolf Hess, life in prison. Joachim von Ribbentrop, hanged. And others who had vanished. Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels, already took their lives. The trials were groundbreaking. They were flawed, yes. Justice is rarely perfect, but they laid the groundwork for future international law. They said, what you do in your uniform matters. Just following orders isn't a free pass. Meanwhile, the United Nations was born, October 24th, 1945. Founded on the smouldering remains of the League of Nations, but this time with teeth and, crucially, an American membership card. Its mission? To prevent future wars, promote peace, and talk things out before the bombs start falling. 50 nations joined. The UN Security Council, with permanent members, the US, the UK, USSR, China, and France, was created to keep the peace. It worked, sometimes. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights would follow in 1948, but its moral foundations were poured here in 1945, in the shock and shame of the Holocaust. Never again, the world said, and then promptly started planning for nuclear deterrence. Because the bomb changed everything. The US, now wielding atomic firepower, emerged from the war as a superpower. So did the Soviet Union, albeit more battered. The balance of power had shifted. The old colonial empires, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, were exhausted. Their colonies watching closely. Decolonization would come next. India, Algeria, Indonesia, Vietnam, some peacefully, some in fire and blood. But the World War II had shattered the illusion that empires were invincible. Japan, occupied by the US under General Douglas MacArthur, was built from the ground up. War crime trials were held. A new constitution was written. The emperor remained, but purely symbolic, and Japan in a few decades would become a democratic industrial powerhouse. Italy became a republic in 1946. Greece teetered into civil war. France reassembled itself with gaulless glue. Poland and much of Eastern Europe fell under Soviet influence. Their democracies dissolved before they could even breathe. And the United States and Soviet Union, already eyeing each other across a newly divided Europe. The Cold War was gestating in the rubble. And yet, amid the ashes, there was also hope. Massive reconstruction efforts began. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, would flood Western Europe with American aid, money, supplies, expertise to rebuild not just infrastructure, but confidence. It wasn't just altruism, it was strategy. Prosperous countries, the thinking went, were less likely to fall to communism. Education systems were built. Art and culture began to re-emerge. The world, wounded but awake, stepped hesitantly into modernity. So, what was the legacy of the peace? It was complicated. A new world order, yes, but fraught with tension. Victory over fascism, but shadowed by genocide and nuclear terror. A foundation for international cooperation built on the graves of millions. The treaties were signed, the borders redrawn, the speeches given, and the people, those who lived, fought, and endured, carried on. Some went home. Some didn't have a home to return to. Some tried to forget. Others never could. But the world did move on. It had to. And that, my dear listener, is how peace arrived. Not with a ribbon or a dove, but with deep, aching exhale. Adolf Hitler, the house painter, who would be Führer. Imagine if your moody, failed artist cousin with a handlebar moustache and a chip on his shoulder got hold of an industrialized nation, a crack army, and enough charisma to hypnotize a country into madness. Yes, we're talking about Adolf Hitler, a name that sends shivers down spines, ruins moustaches for everyone forever, and has kept historians, therapists, and conspiracy theorists gainfully employed for nearly a century. But before he became the genocidal puppet master of Nazi Germany, Hitler was, believe it or not, spectacularly unremarkable. Mediocre in school, second-rate in art, and first class in bitterness. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889 in Braunau am Inn, Austria-Hungary, a town as quaint as its name is unpronounceable after 2 pints of lager. His father, Alois, was a cranky customs official with a fondness for discipline and very little patience for his son's lackluster grades and grandiose daydreaming. Young Adolf wanted to be an artist, but Daddy Dearest wanted him to be a civil servant. Freud would have had a field day. The boy's mother, Clara, was the more tender parent, a devoted, doting soul whom Adolf adored. When she died in 1907 of breast cancer, the young Hitler was devastated. That grief, paired with 2 rejections from the prestigious Academy of Fine Arts Vienna, whose admissions board may still be haunted by guilt, kicked off a slow spiral into aimless obscurity. From 1908 to 1913, Hitler lived in Vienna in what can only be described as a prolonged sulk. He sketched buildings, sold postcards, and developed a stew of bigotry, nationalism, and conspiracy theories, most of which he picked up like a sponge from the city's seedy political underbelly. Anti-Semitism was rampant, and Hitler gulped it down like schnapps at a frat party. He also developed a taste for German nationalism despite, not being German. His world was a bizarre blend of Wagnerian opera, occult nonsense, and the belief that Germany was destined for greatness, and that he naturally would be its saviour. Then came the First World War, and our drifting dilettante finally found his calling. War. When Germany declared war in 1914, Hitler volunteered for the Bavarian army. Still not German, mind you. He served as a messenger on the Western Front, was wounded twice, and was awarded the Iron Cross for bravery. For the first time in his life, he felt useful. War gave him structure, purpose, and most crucially, a sense of belonging. When Germany lost in 1918, Hitler was hospitalized, temporarily blinded by a gas attack, and utterly broken by the defeat. Perhaps the fact that he was no longer able to sport his handlebar moustache contributed to that, as he had been ordered to trim it after it interfered with his gas mask. To him, the loss wasn't just military, it was betrayal. The infamous stab in the back myth, blaming Jews and communists for Germany's defeat, sank its hooks into him. It wasn't true, but truth was never Hitler's strong suit. After the war, Hitler returned to Munich and stayed in the army as an informant. In 1919, he was tasked with spying on a tiny nationalist group, the German Workers' Party. Instead of just taking notes and going home, he joined them. He had found his platform. By 1920, he was giving speeches, gesticulating wildly, and blaming all of Germany's woes on Jews, Marxists, and the Treaty of Versailles. The party changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazi for short, and Hitler changed from footnote to headline. In 1923, he got cocky and tried to overthrow the Bavarian government in the Beer Hall Putsch, a coup that went about as well as a flaming zeppelin. He ended up in prison, where he wrote Mein Kampf, a rambling manifesto full of racial hatred, destiny, and laughably bad prose. Think of it as the literary equivalent of a drunk uncle yelling at the TV. After prison, Hitler rebuilt the Nazi Party, now with a sharper eye for propaganda and a playbook that involved legal takeover instead of beer hall bravado. By the late 1920s, the Weimar Republic was floundering. Political instability, economic collapse, and unemployment turned voters into angry mobs looking for a scapegoat. Hitler was more than happy to provide one. He crisscrossed Germany, delivering firebrand speeches about restoring pride, punishing traitors, and building a pure Aryan state. With Joseph Goebbels orchestrating the propaganda machine, the Nazis became a force to be reckoned with. In 1933, after a suspicious fire gutted the Reichstag and fear of communism peaked, Hitler was appointed Chancellor. In one fell swoop of legal manipulation and thug intimidation, democracy died with a whimper. Once in power, Hitler moved fast. The Enabling Act of 1933 gave him dictatorial authority. The Nazis banned opposition parties, crushed unions, and began cleansing Germany. The SS and Gestapo became instruments of terror. Books were burned, professors silenced, and children indoctrinated. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 stripped Jews of citizenship. Kristallnacht in 1938, a coordinated orgy of anti-Jewish violence, signalled that things were only going to get worse. Meanwhile, Hitler was playing international poker. He reoccupied the Rhineland, annexed Austria in the Anschluss, and carved up Czechoslovakia with the finesse of a butcher. Britain and France wagged their fingers, but did little else. In 1939, Hitler signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin, shocking everyone. Then he invaded Poland. Cue World War II. Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, smashed through Europe. France fell, the Low Countries crumbled, and Hitler seemed invincible. But hubris is a hell of a drug. In 1941, he invaded the Soviet Union, breaking the Pact and opening a two-front war that would bleed Germany dry. He also declared war on the United States. Brilliant strategy, really. Pick fights with the three biggest industrial powers on Earth. Behind the front lines, the Holocaust raged. 6 million Jews, along with Roma, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and others, were exterminated in death camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka. It was industrialized genocide, planned with bureaucratic coldness and carried out with mechanical efficiency. By 1944, the tide had turned. D-Day opened the Western Front. The Soviets pushed from the east. Germany was being squeezed like a sad bratwurst in a vice. Still, Hitler refused to surrender. He retreated to his underground bunker in Berlin, railing against traitors, eating vegetarian meals, and marrying his longtime companion, Eva Braun. Then, in April 1945, as the Red Army closed in, he shot himself. Eva took cyanide. Their bodies were burned in the courtyard above. So what do we make of him, this failed artist turned genocidal dictator? Hitler wasn't a monster from birth. He was shaped by humiliation, war, ideology, and sheer opportunism. He tapped into a nation's fear and fury and amplified it to apocalyptic proportions. History has rightfully condemned him. His name is a universal shorthand for evil. But it is also a lesson. Democracy is fragile. Hate is infectious. And one bitter man with a microphone can cause unimaginable destruction. Benito Mussolini, Il Duce, and the great Italian farce. Now we cross the Alps into the land of pasta, opera, and wildly ill-advised military adventures. Welcome to the tale of Benito Mussolini, the chest-thumping, chin-jutting founding father of fascism, who turned Italy into a banana republic, without the bananas. Before Hitler had goose-stepping stormtroopers, Mussolini had strutting black shirts. Before Stalin had a cult of personality, Benito had portraits of his chin plastered across every wall in Rome. And before the world was plunged into chaos, Mussolini was already flexing like a bad actor in a toga. So let's unravel the tale of Il Duce, the man who mistook himself for a Roman emperor, but ended up dangling by his heels. Benito Amilcare Andrea Mussolini was born on July 29, 1883, in Predappio, a sleepy village in northern Italy that has since spent the better part of a century trying to forget him. His father was a blacksmith and passionate socialist who named him after leftist heroes. His mother was a devout schoolteacher who probably hoped he'd grow up to do something quieter. Young Benito was a bright student, but also a holy terror. Knife fights, expulsions, the works. Think classroom rebel with a superiority complex. He qualified as a schoolteacher in 1901, but quickly realized that filling young minds wasn't nearly as satisfying as filling columns with his own ideas. Here's the twist. Mussolini started as a socialist, a fiery one. He edited socialist newspapers, railed against capitalism, and admired Marx. In 1911, he was jailed for protesting Italy's invasion of Libya. The left adored him. He was seen as a revolutionary, rising star. But then came World War I. While most socialists opposed the war as an imperialist squabble, Mussolini broke ranks and supported intervention. Why? Because war, he said, would forge a stronger, manlier Italy. Also, he liked the idea of blowing stuff up. The party kicked him out. He shrugged, dusted off his ego, and moved on. In 1919, he founded the Fasci di Combattimento, a mix of angry war veterans, nationalists, and unemployed toughs with an aesthetic taste for violence and Roman cosplay. The early 1920s were messy in Italy. Strikes, fear of communism, and a general sense of what on earth is happening gave Mussolini the perfect opening. He sold fascism as the antidote to chaos, order, nationalism, discipline, and very loud parades. In 1922, Mussolini staged the infamous March on Rome. It was more publicity stunt than real threat, but the king, Victor Emmanuel III, who made wet cardboard look decisive, invited Mussolini to form a government. And just like that, Benito went from rabble-rouser to prime minister. Once in power, Mussolini began the typical dictator-starter pack. He crushed opposition, muzzled the press, stacked the courts, and filled the streets with uniformed thugs. By 1925, Italy was a one-party fascist state, and Mussolini had crowned himself Il Duce, the leader, with the subtlety of a trumpet solo. Mussolini ruled Italy like he was starring in an opera about himself. Speeches from balconies, grand gestures, epic posturing. He had slogans for everything. Believe, obey, fight, and Mussolini is always right. Spoiler, he was not. He drained swamps, built roads, and declared battle against wheat. Yes, wheat, trying to make Italy self-sufficient in grain. It was less economic policy, more ego project. He controlled the media, the schools, and even fashion. If you weren't in uniform, were you even Italian? Dissenters disappeared or were sent to exile islands where boredom was weaponized. But unlike Hitler's terrifying efficiency or Stalin's icy terror, Mussolini's regime often veered into farce. His grand plans frequently sputtered, his bureaucracy fumbled, and his advisors were yes men with medals. Mussolini believed Italy deserved an empire like Britain or France. In 1935, he invaded Ethiopia, using poison gas and modern weapons against spear-wielding defenders. He won, if you call slaughtering civilians and incurring global condemnation winning. The League of Nations wagged its fingers and imposed sanctions, which Mussolini wore like a badge of honour. Feeling snubbed by the West, he snuggled up to a rising Hitler. In 1936, they formed the Rome-Berlin Axis, a bromance sealed with fascist handshakes and shared delusions of grandeur. But let's be clear, Hitler saw Mussolini as a useful amateur. Mussolini saw Hitler as a partner in glory. He badly misread the room. When Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, Mussolini hesitated. Italy wasn't ready for war. Its military was outdated, under-equipped, and confused on a good day. But Benito couldn't resist the lure of glory. In 1940, he declared war on France and Britain, hoping for easy spoils. Spoiler, it did not go well. Italy's campaigns in Greece, North Africa, and the Balkans were disasters. The Germans constantly had to bail them out. Mussolini's ego demanded conquest. His military couldn't deliver a pizza. Then came the final blunder. Aligning with Hitler against the Soviet Union and the United States. By the early 1940s, Italy was being bombed, invaded, and ridiculed. The Italian people were starving and disillusioned. Mussolini had gone from national saviour to national embarrassment. In 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily. Italy turned on Mussolini faster than you can say ciao. The king dismissed him, and he was arrested. Italy signed an armistice with the Allies. For a brief moment, it seemed like Benito's story had ended, but Hitler wasn't done with him. German commandos rescued Mussolini and set him up as puppet ruler of the so-called Italian Social Republic in northern Italy. It was a grim parody of his former regime, propped up by SS troops and spite. By 1945, with the Allies closing in, Mussolini tried to flee to Switzerland in disguise. But Italian partisans captured him near Lake Como. On April 28, 1945, he and his mistress Clara Petacci were executed. Their bodies were strung up in Milan, grim symbols of a failed fascist fantasy. So what do we make of Il Duce? A revolutionary who became a tyrant, a socialist turned fascist, a man who mistook drama for leadership, applause for success, and war for theatre. Mussolini invented fascism, but he couldn't control it. He made Italy a stage and cast himself as hero, general, and god. But his play ended in tragedy, and the audience finally booed him off the stage. Joseph Stalin, the man of steel with a heart of ice. We've slogged through Hitler's tantrums and Mussolini's melodramas. Now it's time to plunge into the icy abyss that was Joseph Stalin. If Hitler was the face of fascist terror and Mussolini its clownish understudy, Stalin was something else entirely. The architect of paranoia, the high priest of purges, and the man who could make an entire nation disappear, both literally and on paper. His name means man of steel, and oh, how he lived up to it. Not with courage, mind you, but with sheer ruthlessness. Joseph Vissarionovich Djugashvili was born in December 1878 in Gori, Georgia, a rough little town in the Caucasus where wine flowed freely and tempers flared like stove fires. He was the son of a shoemaker father with a mean streak and a devout mother who dreamed of her son becoming a priest. Little Eoseb, as he was known then, was smart, small, and stubborn. He went to seminary, studied the Bible, and was well on his way to the cloth before Marxism seduced him away. Instead of sermons, he started devouring revolutionary ideas. Out went the cross. In came the hammer. He also ditched his last name, taking up the moniker Stalin, meaning man of steel. Modesty was never his strong suit. In the early 1900s, Stalin wasn't the main event. He was the guy in the back room robbing banks to fund the Bolsheviks. He organized heists, bombings, and general chaos in service of Lenin's revolutionary cause. He was exiled to Siberia multiple times, escaped multiple times, and played a dangerous game of hide-and-seek with the Tsar's secret police. But even within the Bolshevik party, Stalin was often overlooked. Lenin, Trotsky, and the intellectual bigwigs hogged the limelight, while Stalin quietly built networks and took notes. He wasn't flashy. He was meticulous. He collected information like a paranoid librarian and never forgot a slight. When the Russian Revolution exploded in 1917, Stalin played a minor role. But after the Bolsheviks seized power, he worked his way up, becoming General Secretary in 1922, a title that sounded boring but gave him control over appointments and promotions. Spoiler, he used it like a scalpel. Lenin suffered a series of strokes and died in 1924. Before he passed, he warned the party that Stalin was dangerous. Naturally, Stalin made sure that warning never got much airtime. Through a mix of manipulation, smear campaigns, and old-fashioned backstabbing, Stalin sidelined his rivals, especially Trotsky, whom he eventually forced into exile and later had murdered with an ice pick in Mexico. Because of course he did. Once in full control, Stalin went full throttle. He industrialized the USSR at breakneck speed, The 5-year plans were ambitious on paper and brutal in execution. Steel output skyrocketed, but so did misery. Cities grew, but the countryside bled. He collectivized agriculture, forcing peasants into massive state-run farms. When they resisted, he crushed them. The result? Famine, particularly in Ukraine, where the Holodomor, 1932-33, killed millions. Whether it was neglect, cruelty, or genocidal intent, it was catastrophe, Soviet style. And then came the purges. From the mid-1930s onward, Stalin turned his paranoia into policy. The Great Terror consumed the Communist Party, the Red Army, the intelligentsia, and random citizens alike. Show trials, torture, executions. No one was safe. Neighbours informed on neighbours. Family ties meant nothing. Even loyal allies vanished overnight. By 1939, Stalin had killed or imprisoned millions, rewriting history to suit his myth, and airbrushing old comrades out of photographs. The Soviet Union became a surveillance state on steroids, run by fear and fueled by lies. In August 1939, with war looming in Europe, Stalin shocked the world by signing a non-aggression pact with Adolf Hitler, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Yes, the communist icon teamed up with the fascist tyrant. They agreed not to invade each other and secretly carved up Eastern Europe between them. Days later, Hitler invaded Poland. 2 weeks after that, the Soviets strolled in from the east. Stalin got half of Poland, the Baltics, and a bloody nose trying to take Finland, which fought like frostbitten demons. He thought he'd bought peace, but in June 1941, Hitler stabbed him in the back with Operation Barbarossa, launching the largest invasion in history. Stalin, caught off guard and almost catatonic with shock, recovered just in time to launch one of the most brutal counterattacks in human history. Once Stalin got his bearings, he unleashed the Soviet war machine with terrifying force. The Red Army, battered and bleeding, began a slow, scorched earth push back. Cities were sacrificed, entire populations deported, but Moscow held. Then Leningrad, then famously Stalingrad, the turning point. Stalingrad wasn't just a battle, it was a meat grinder. Soldiers were sent in with no rifles, told to pick one up from a dead comrade. Casualties were obscene, but the Soviets held, and then pushed. By 1945, the Red Army had steamrolled its way to Berlin. Along the way, they liberated death camps, exacted brutal revenge on German civilians, and left a swath of destruction behind them. When the dust settled, Stalin emerged as one of the victors of World War II and the architect of the Eastern Bloc. Post-war, Stalin wasted no time locking down Eastern Europe. Puppet regimes, secret police, and Soviet tanks became the norm from Warsaw to Bucharest. The Iron Curtain fell and the Cold War began. Domestically, he returned to his old habits. More purges, more paranoia, more propaganda. Science, art, even genetics were distorted to serve his vision. Citizens lived in constant fear. Children were taught to worship him. His image was everywhere, stern, mustachioed, omnipresent. In March 1953, Stalin finally died, probably of a stroke, though his own doctors had been purged, so who knows? His death sparked both relief and chaos. The cult of personality cracked. Khrushchev, one of his successors, later denounced him in the famous secret speech, calling out his crimes and paranoia. But the scars remained. The Gulag system, the mass graves, the rewriting of truth, those weren't so easily undone. Joseph Stalin left behind a transformed Soviet Union, a global superpower built on corpses and concrete. He industrialized a peasant empire and helped defeat Hitler, but at a monstrous cost. He is remembered as both war hero and war criminal. For some, he was the man who saved the USSR. For many others, he was a tyrant who devoured his own people. Stalin didn't just shape the 20th century. He scarred it. A reminder that terror doesn't always wear a swastika. Sometimes it comes with medals, moustaches, and a 5-year plan. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the president who rolled into war and rolled over fascism. Time to cross the Atlantic and meet the man who led the free world with a cigarette holder, a winning grin, and a steel spine that polio couldn't break. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR to the world, was the only US president elected 4 times, a man who saved capitalism from itself, redefined the presidency, and parked himself in a wheelchair while rolling circles around dictators. If Churchill was the voice and Stalin the sledgehammer, FDR was the strategist, calm, confident, occasionally cunning, the architect of both the New Deal and the Allied win. Franklin was born in 1882 to wealth and privilege in Hyde Park, New York. Imagine Downton Abbey with more trees and slightly less rigid Britishness. He was a distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, who was already striding around the White House when Franklin was just a Harvard lad figuring out how to make law look glamorous. He married his cousin Eleanor Roosevelt in 1905. Yes, that cousin, distant, but still eyebrow-raising. Eleanor would go on to become one of the most influential first ladies in history, but more on that later. FDR started his political career young and ambitious, serving in the New York State Senate, then as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson during World War I. Everything seemed preordained for greatness, until fate flipped the script. In 1921, at the age of 39, Roosevelt contracted polio. It paralyzed him from the waist down. For many, this would have been the end of a career. For FDR, it was the beginning of a myth. He refused to accept defeat. He swam. He struggled. He trained his upper body. And most crucially, he perfected the art of appearing mobile. He wore leg braces, used canes, leaned on aids, and made sure cameras never showed him vulnerable. His condition was public knowledge, but rarely seen. And in that invisible battle, he forged a toughness no one had seen before. He would never walk unaided again, but he would march history forward. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, America face-planted into economic despair. By 1932, the country was on its knees, and Hoover's administration had all the warmth of a tax audit. Enter Roosevelt. He ran on hope, confidence, and catchy slogans. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. He won by a landslide and launched into action with unmatched zeal. The New Deal wasn't one program, it was a buffet of reform. Social Security, the FDIC, public works projects, financial regulations. He created jobs, built infrastructure, and started reshaping the relationship between government and citizen. He was beloved by the working class and loathed by the rich. So naturally, he was re-elected 3 more times. FDR hated war. He'd seen it up close, but he also wasn't naive. As Hitler goose-stepped through Europe and Japan menaced the Pacific, Roosevelt began shifting gears. While America clung to isolationism, FDR sent aid to Britain through Lend-Lease, built up the military, and warned anyone who'd listen that trouble was brewing. He had to tread carefully. Congress didn't want war. The public didn't want war, but Roosevelt saw the writing on the wall and started preparing. Then came Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. Game on. Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor killed over 2,400 Americans and destroyed much of the Pacific Fleet. Roosevelt addressed Congress the next day with one of the most iconic speeches in US history. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. War was declared. America was in, and FDR shifted from economic savior to wartime commander-in-chief. Factories were retooled, drafts were issued, rationing began. America became the arsenal of democracy, churning out tanks, ships, and optimism on an industrial scale. FDR didn't just lead from behind a desk, he strategized. He coordinated the Allied leadership. He worked closely with Churchill, exchanging letters, meetings, and the occasional passive-aggressive telegram. He also met with Stalin, most notably at the Yalta Conference in 1945, where the three leaders discussed post-war Europe. It was here that the seeds of the Cold War were sown, though Roosevelt was more focused on ending World War II than preventing future friction. He walked the tightrope between idealism and realism, trying to preserve peace while keeping Stalin on a leash and Churchill in the loop. Not all was glorious. FDR's record isn't spotless. The internment of Japanese Americans, over 100,000 people forcibly relocated and incarcerated, remains one of the darkest stains on his presidency. He also did little to address the racism and segregation still deeply entrenched in American society. His policies saved the economy, but didn't always reach everyone equally. Eleanor, meanwhile, pushed from within, advocating for civil rights, women's rights, and social reform. She was the conscience he didn't always heed, but could never silence. In 1944, Roosevelt ran for an unprecedented fourth term. He was clearly ailing, exhausted, frail, worn down by years of war and leadership. But he won. The country trusted him, needed him. But in April 1945, just months before the end of the war in Europe, Roosevelt suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and died at his retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia. He was 63. The news stunned the world. Americans wept openly. Churchill mourned. Even Stalin offered condolences, then immediately started probing for geopolitical weakness. FDR reshaped the American presidency. He made it active, central, and human. He talked to people through the radio like a neighbour. He led a fractured nation through its darkest economic hours and its most perilous war. He wasn't perfect, but he was effective. And he was brave, not in battle, but in resolve. He proved that leadership isn't about standing tall, it's about standing firm. Winston Churchill, the bulldog with a cigar and a vengeance. Now we trade in moustaches for monocles and jackboots for polished brogues. Enter Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, warlord, wordsmith, whiskey enthusiast, and the man who stared down the Nazis with a cigar clenched in his jowls and a vocabulary sharper than most bayonets. If Hitler was the madman and Stalin the monster, Churchill was the bulldog, growling, stubborn, and impossible to ignore. He was part Victorian relic, part modern legend, with a voice like gravel soaked in brandy and a mind full of history, hubris, and half a dozen contingency plans. Winston Churchill was born on November 30th, 1874 in Blenheim Palace, which sounds exactly as posh as it is. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a Tory aristocrat with a brilliant mind and a terminal case of arrogance. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was a dazzling American socialite who brought fire and scandal to the British elite. Young Winston was a late bloomer. He stuttered. He struggled in school. And he was better at toy soldiers than algebra. But he had something you can't teach. Self-belief so potent it could power the national grid. Eventually, he found his way into the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, which he miraculously passed. Thus began a lifelong romance with war, words, and well-cut uniforms. In the late 19th century, Churchill gallivanted across the globe as a war correspondent with a side hustle in actual fighting. He dodged bullets in Cuba, charged with the cavalry in Sudan, and escaped a Boer prison camp in South Africa. And he wrote about it all, naturally, in thrilling prose. By the time he entered Parliament in 1900, he was already famous, not just for adventure, but for ambition. He switched parties twice and became First Lord of the Admiralty by World War I, where he was involved in the catastrophic Gallipoli campaign. Most men would have faded into footnote status. Not Churchill. He regrouped, rewrote the narrative, and eventually clawed his way back into power. In the 1930s, Churchill found himself in the political wilderness. His views on India read very imperial. His flip-flopping loyalties and his gruff manner made him unpopular. He was dismissed as out of touch, a relic. But, while the rest of Europe flirted with appeasement, Churchill was the lone voice shouting about Hitler. He read Mein Kampf and took it seriously. He watched the rearmament of Germany and said, "This is bad." And the government said, "Don't be dramatic." He was dramatic, yes, but he was also right. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939 and World War II exploded, the British government needed someone with grit. In 1940, after Neville Chamberlain's appeasement policy collapsed like a poorly baked pudding, Churchill became Prime Minister. He arrived at 10 Downing Street with a mission: fight. And his first order of business was delivering the kind of speeches that should have come with brass fanfare and flaming swords. We shall fight on the beaches, their finest hour, never surrender. He wasn't just rallying Britain. He was holding it together with sheer willpower and colourful metaphors. In 1940, after France fell, Britain stood alone against the Nazi war machine. Churchill faced Hitler's Luftwaffe, the Blitz bombings, and a terrified, exhausted population. His secret weapon: defiance. He formed a coalition government, tightened ties with the United States, and leaned on the Royal Air Force, the few who held the skies in the Battle of Britain. While buildings crumbled and cities burned, Churchill strode through rubble with a cigar in one hand and a growl in his throat. And he drank. Oh, did he drink? Champagne for breakfast, whiskey at lunch, and brandy for dessert. He called it fuel. Churchill needed help, and he knew exactly who could provide it. Franklin D. Roosevelt. The two men couldn't have been more different. FDR calm and calculating, Churchill bombastic and boozy. But they clicked, with charm, grit, and a barrage of letters and telegrams. Churchill wooed FDR. The result? Lend-Lease, American aid, and eventually US boots on the ground. Their relationship was a crucial alliance, equal parts strategy and bromance that helped tilt the war in the Allies' favour. By 1942, things were shifting. victories in North Africa, the Soviets holding at Stalingrad, the Allies pushing back. Churchill, Roosevelt, and later Stalin formed the Big Three, a high-stakes poker table where the fate of the world was shuffled and reshuffled. In 1944, Operation Overlord, D-Day, launched from the English coast. Churchill wanted to be there, gun in hand. His generals said no. He pouted, but the invasion worked. Hitler was on the run. The war was ending, and Churchill's time in the sun seemed assured. In May 1945, the war in Europe ended. Churchill was a hero, the saviour of Britain, the voice of resistance. So naturally, in July, the British people voted him out of office. Why? Because they were tired. They wanted social reform, housing, jobs, things Churchill hadn't focused on. They respected him, adored him, but didn't rehire him. Churchill took it as well as could be expected. That is, he sulked and wrote memoirs. He returned as Prime Minister in 1951, but age and illness slowed him. By 1955, he retired from politics for good. He continued writing, earning the Nobel Prize in Literature, and spent his final years painting, reminiscing, and refusing to diet. He died in 1965 at the age of 90. His funeral was massive, state level, sombre, and steeped in history. Even his enemies paid respects. Winston Churchill was not a saint. He made catastrophic decisions. Gallipoli, the Bengal famine, held imperialist views and never really warmed to the idea of post-colonial freedom. But when the world needed a voice of defiance, he roared. When Britain teetered on the brink, he held the line. And when tyranny threatened, he lit a cigar, raised an eyebrow, and dared it to come closer. Harry S. Truman, the accidental president with a world-shattering decision. Now we meet the man who stepped into the hottest seat in history without so much as a warning. Harry S. Truman, short in stature, modest in origin, and blessed with exactly zero preparation for what awaited him. One day, he was vice president. The next, he was commander-in-chief of a nation at war, inheriting Franklin Roosevelt's unfinished legacy, global chaos, and a secret so enormous it could split atoms and cities wide open. This is the story of the plain-spoken haberdasher from Missouri who dropped the biggest bombshell in history. Literally. Harry Truman was born in 1884 in Lamar, Missouri, to a farming family. No silver spoons here, just hard work, good manners, and the kind of thick-rimmed glasses that screamed, "I read the manual twice." He didn't go to an Ivy League school. He didn't serve in high office until later in life. He worked as a bank clerk, a farmer, and yes, a failed haberdasher. His clothing store folded in the early 1920s, but Harry never stopped showing up in neatly pressed suits. Some habits die hard. World War I gave him his first real taste of leadership. He served in France as an artillery captain, and by all accounts he was calm, competent, and completely uninterested in taking any nonsense. After the war, he entered politics with help from Missouri's infamous Pendergast political machine. Yes, it was corrupt. Yes, it was shady. But Truman wasn't. He kept his nose clean, eyes forward, and slowly climbed the ladder. Truman was elected to the US Senate in 1934. For years, he was overshadowed by louder voices, until World War II broke out. Truman chaired a Senate committee investigating war profiteering and mismanagement. And here's the twist. He was brilliant at it. The Truman Committee saved taxpayers billions and earned him a reputation for honesty and efficiency. He was practical, no nonsense, and allergic to waste. By 1944, Roosevelt, running for a fourth term, needed a new vice president. The previous one, Henry Wallace, was too liberal and too weird for the party bosses. Truman was the safe bet. And so, he became vice president for 82 days. Then FDR died. On April 12th, 1945, Truman was having a quiet day when he was summoned to the White House. Eleanor Roosevelt greeted him with devastating news. Harry, the president, is dead. Truman asked if there was anything he could do for her. She replied, "Is there anything we can do for you? You're the one in trouble now." And trouble came fast. Within hours, Truman learned about the Manhattan Project. He had known nothing about it as vice president. Now he was handed the power to annihilate cities with the flick of a pen. Germany surrendered in May 1945. Japan held out. Truman, faced with a brutal invasion plan that could cost hundreds of thousands of lives, authorized the use of atomic bombs to force surrender. On August 6, 1945, Hiroshima was obliterated. 3 days later, Nagasaki. The devastation was beyond comprehension. Japan surrendered. World War II was over. The morality of that decision has been debated ever since. Truman believed it was necessary. Others saw it as the opening salvo of the Cold War. But the fact remains. He ended the deadliest conflict in human history in the most devastating way imaginable. Peace was no cakewalk. Truman had to help rebuild a shattered world, and he did it with bold strokes. The Marshall Plan, massive aid to rebuild Europe and prevent the spread of communism. The United Nations, backed by Truman to replace the ineffective League of Nations. The Truman Doctrine, American commitment to defend democracy from Soviet expansion. The Cold War began under Truman's watch, and he didn't blink. He recognized Israel. He desegregated the military. He faced down Stalin over Berlin. And he sent US troops to Korea when the North invaded the South in 1950, starting America's first Cold War conflict. Truman was never universally loved. He was blunt, brash, and occasionally cranky. He called it like he saw it. And sometimes what he saw was a steaming pile of nonsense. In 1948, everyone expected him to lose the presidential election to Thomas Dewey. Newspapers famously printed Dewey defeats Truman before the votes were even fully counted. Truman won, barely, but decisively. The upset shocked the nation. He had done it the Truman way, on a whistle-stop train tour, shaking hands, making jokes, and speaking directly to the people. Truman chose not to run again in 1952. He returned to Missouri with no pension, no Secret Service detail, and no heirs to political power. He walked the streets alone, answered his own phone, and wrote his memoirs. He died in 1972 at the age of 88. At the time, opinions were still mixed, but history has been kinder. He is now seen as one of the most consequential presidents in US history, not because he was flashy, but because he was decisive. He made the calls others flinched from. He understood the weight of power and bore it with grit and humility. Truman's famous desk plaque read, "The buck stops here," and it did. He made the hard choices. He dropped the bomb. He rebuilt the world. He held the line when the Cold War ignited. He wasn't born for greatness. But when greatness called, he picked up, adjusted his glasses and said, "All right, let's get to work."